What I want to speak about, as it was said, is divine action and within the framework of emergentist panentheism. And I want to offer a critical evaluation of this project from my perspective. As you can see, I am a Dominican, so I come from the classical Aristotelian Thomistic school. And within this school, I read and I approach this framework of panentheism and panentheistic notion of divine action. So the point of departure for us is, yes, panentheism. I found this image some time ago and I actually like it very much. Panentheism, which, as you all, I guess, know, is a claim that everything is in God. God includes, but is not exhausted by the universe, right? So panentheism, which has a very long tradition, is grounded in a way, as if we want to classify it today, I guess, within the logic of a relative or dialectic identity, which is identity in difference. As such, panentheism therefore should be distinguished from several other possible versions of theism that are being discussed nowadays. So definitely it should be distinguished from classical theism, but also from deism and pantheism or pandeism. This is one other option, but also from panentheism. So I will not define all those terms. I hope you are familiar with them. What is at stake here in my presentation is basically panentheism with, in comparison with the classical theology, classical theism. Okay, so I hope you had a chance at least to look into my recent book or into the paper that I recently published in Sofia. And in the paper, actually, I suggest a list of at least 6, I call them species, you may say, aspects of the panentheistic framework, theological framework. What interests me the most here is what I call a scientific panentheism, that is panentheism developed or supported by the theology of divine action in reference to natural science. And this is the project that was developed primarily and first of all by Arthur Peacock and then Philip Clayton. Peacock is deceased already, Clayton is still alive, and he is a very prolific author in philosophy and theology. So thinking about divine action in panentheism, and Peacock, as he presents it, I will concentrate or spend a lot of time on Peacock today. So he claims that if we take this panentheistic, or maybe his approach is slightly different, he just wants to describe the way he understands, how he understands divine action in the universe as a scientist. And so he claims that we should look at the universe as a whole and envision God who could affect holistically the state of the world as such, the world which, in his account, can be regarded, at least metaphorically, as a part of God, a part of the divine. So he claims, building on this preliminary statement, that God could be regarded as exerting a continuous holistic constraint on the world as a whole. And here already he refers to the notion of our mind controlling or our actions and us as human beings. So this is his analogy to mind and body relationship. And most importantly here, he suggests that there must be and there is an interface of the connection and relation between God and the universe. And it is so he claims that God, once again, acts at the totality of the world. And he claims that this interface, the causal joint, is between God and the totality of the universe. And what happens is that God transmits information, so he informs the universe in a way that he claims does not involve matter or energy or any forces. So there's no physical change in a way. I mean, the physical change, according to him, will happen in the universe, but what God communicates is nothing physical. It's just it's divine action, which is a divine information of some sort. So what is important for Peacock, such unitive and holistic effect of God on the world can occur without abrogating any of the laws or regularities which apply to the levels of the world's constituents, right? Once again, God would be doing this without intervening in the supposed gaps provided by the in principle inherent unpredictabilities of that we observe in our scientific account of the universe. Now, his approach to divine action, therefore, because I began with his approach to divine action, is definitely panentheistic. And he calls, or we call, his position an emergentist panentheism, where his ontology, he himself describes his ontology as emergentist monism. So all entities at the end of the day are constituted of fundamental physical entities, whatever these entities are, and this is physics that teaches us what they are. So with respect to current physical theories, but and from this reality, within this reality of basic, physical entities, there are more complex things that emerge, right? And this emergence is possible for him because this reality and those emergence are irreducible for Peacock. And this happens for him because all this reality is found in God himself. Therefore, God, in Peacock's account, should be conceived as part of the circumambient reality, which encloses all existing entities. These are very important statements that he makes in this quotation. So once again, God is best conceived as the circumambient reality enclosing all existing entities, structures, and processes, and operating in and through all while being more than all. All that is not God has its existence, listen carefully, within God's operation and being. Therefore, the infinity of God includes all other finite entities, structures, and processes. God's infinity comprehends and incorporates all. I will refer to all those qualifiers later on. On another place, he claims that the processes that take care in the universe, also emergent phenomena that are outcomes of these processes, are not themselves God, but the action of God as the creator. So we can see how he is trying to put the panentheistic understanding of the relationship between God and the universe into practice in a way, or frame it within his understanding of how, scientific understanding of how more complex things emerge from basic and less complex physical stuff. Now, as part of like being a panentheist, Peacock acknowledges that once we or he agrees with the claim that the universe in some way is within God, he has what has to follow is a divine decision that God allows for his inherent omnipotence and omniscience to be modified, restricted, and curtailed by the very open-endedness of the universe, or open-endedness that he bestowed on the universe. So he says this is his one of his earlier works, but one of the most important ones, the Theology for the Scientific Age is the title of the book. So there he claims that divine omnipotence God decides to limit his divine omnipotence because of the fact that in the world there are certain areas, such as human will, over which God chooses not to have power. He also limits his divine omnipotence because there are certain systems whose future states cannot be known even to God himself, since they are not, in principle, not knowable, claims Peacock. All this becomes the expression of divine kenosis, the self-limitation of God's omnipotence and omniscience, and it speaks about the vulnerability and self-emptying kenosis of God, who suffers in and under the creative process of the world. So these are themes that are very popular among those who follow the panentheistic version of theism. He also claims that God, therefore, cannot be conceived as entirely timeless. God is temporal on his account, in the sense that divine life is successive in its relation to us, to the universe. So God is temporally related to what happens in the universe. He uses in all this, or introduces the analogy of God. I mean, the analogy between, this is the analogy of proportion here. The way God is related to the world may be compared to the relation between mind and body, although he makes some important qualifications. He says that we have to remember that God creates the universe while our mind does not create us. Second, God is conscious of everything that happens in the universe, whereas many of our actions are actually unconscious. And the third point, he says that God is not just personal, he is at least personal, more than personal, or even supra-personal or transpersonal. So he introduces those qualifiers, but still thinks that the analogy is meaningful. And then there's a big question to what extent Peacock's version of panentheism or emergentist panentheism falls within the categories typical for process theism. In a very short note in one of the footnotes in one of his main works, he simply claims that he wants to distance himself from process philosophy, and he doesn't. In my opinion, I've read most of his works. He doesn't explicitly state what his philosophical presuppositions are, other than just claiming that his ontology is emergentist monism, or is emergentist monistic one. Okay, so this is the exposition of his work for those of you who are not familiar with his understanding of divine action. Now, the second part would be a number of questions that I would like to ask. So the first one refers to the very meaning of the term panentheism, and it refers to Peacock definitely, and to other versions of panentheism as well. So there has been already a critical study of this topic, and there is several authors who speak about it. And I think that at least among some of them, there is an agreement that that it's not easy actually to square the exact meaning of this preposition "in." Everything is in God. So we may say that once we try to follow various panentheistic theologians, we realize that panentheism with respect to this preposition becomes a family resemblance concept. So trying to square the meaning of this preposition leads us to a continuum of metaphors. And these are metaphors that may go from God conceived as totally separate from the cosmos to God as totally dependent or even coterminous with the cosmos, with 13 steps in between. This is the list provided by Brierley in his paper. Another list provided by Clayton ranges from the idea of world being in God, meaning that this is its literal location, to the claim that panentheism means that God simply befriends or graces the world. So you can see these are like extremist positions with this time 10 steps in between. So there is a great difficulty that panentheists actually acknowledge in trying to define the core meaning of the very term that they coined or that they propose for understanding their own theistic position. So Peacock tries to be more specific and tries to explain what he means by panentheism. And he claims that panentheism refers to an ontological relation, so that the world is conceived as within the being of God, but nevertheless with its own distinct ontology. And we would say this is a smart move. He also claims that God cannot in principle have any spatial attributes, so this preposition in cannot mean a spatial location. But then I claim that the language he uses is confusing, because then he is not clear in what he actually understands by the notion of God who includes, comprehends, and closes and incorporates as the circumambient reality. So I think that Peacock, this is one of my challenges, Peacock remains at the risk of mereologization and spatialization of the theological discourse, that he still risks thinking God in spatial terms with a relationship within his relationship to the universe. Okay. And Philip Clayton, who is a great admirer of Peacock's panentheism, he actually, in my opinion, leans toward pantheism, because I think this is also one of the dangers in Peacock, but in Clayton, it becomes much more apparent, okay? So in his early statement in 1999, Clayton claims that the infinite God is ontologically as close as to finite things as possible, but he still remains distinct from the created universe. And you can see that his claim here is that panentheism should be defined ontologically, or the preposition "and" should be defined ontologically. Yet in 2004, he changes his mind in a way, I think. He claims that it is rather a logical inclusion that we should refer here to, rather than the primarily one of location. Yet in 2010, he makes a very bold claims in his important paper, Panentheism East and West, when he tries to compare Eastern and Western versions of panentheism. And there he claims that if you are a panentheist, you probably should agree, or you even already think this way, that objects are ultimately speaking just modes or manifestations or expressions of the one, that is God. So their appearance is as separate, independent existence is not ultimately real. This is a very surprising, in a way, statement, I think, which will, I'm not sure whether panentheists themselves would agree with that. And then he adds to this that in his understanding of God, God is not only the efficient cause of things, but he also becomes the substrative cause, that of which everything is made. So again, a very bold claim. So now, leaving aside the question of how we understand this proposition, and which I think doesn't have a clear answer to it, Clayton, for example, claims that it is a virtue of panentheism because it can host many different views of God. And he claims that it should be treated as a scientific research program with a hardcore and the protective belt of hypothesis. In my paper, I bring a criticism of this attitude, because then if we want to treat panentheism as this research, scientific research project, then this preposition in will be in the hard core of this project, and we would expect, I guess, that the hard core is clearly defined, which it is not, in my understanding. But what is at stake even more here, especially now when we want to refer to the classical theism, are immanence and transcendence of God. Okay, so there is a group of several panentheists who claim that what panentheism is basically about is divine immanence, which they claim is forgotten in the classical theism. This is a claim that is being brought by many contemporary panentheists, especially those that work in science and theology dialogue. Now, first, we should go, I believe, to Aquinas, just to realize how deep and profound is his theology of divine immanence. And you may be familiar with this already. This is at the beginning of his Summa Theologiae that I want to refer to, where Aquinas says that God is in all things, not indeed as part of their essence, nor as an accident, but as an agent is present to that upon which it works. So he claims God is in all things and innermostly. Yet whenever he says things like that, we have to remember that he has the approach within which he predicates about God analogically and not univocally. Then he builds on this preliminary statement, specifying it by saying that God is in everything by his power, by his presence, and by his essence. This is a very strong claim. Once again, this is the analogical predication where the essence, the presence of God as the essence of things would not be or will not or is not God's very essence being present in the creatures. It is rather God's presence as the essence, as the created essence of things, because the essences of things are created and God's essence is totally transcendent and not created. Okay, so we have to have it in mind that his predication is analogical always. And then Aquinas, at some point in the same question, but back in the first article, brings a claim which is purely panentheistic, you may say, because Aquinas says this: that in which bodily things exist contains them, but immaterial things contain that in which they exist. So they contain things from within, as the soul contains the body from within. So God also contains things by existing in them, we should add, from within. However, one does use the bodily metaphor and talk about everything being in God, right? Inasmuch as he contains them. So this is the picture on which God is like outside and consists things inside of him. But Aquinas says the more proper language would be to say that God is present and contains things from within what they are. Now, I bring this quotation especially because Niels Henrik Gregersen is the one, I think, who actually really read at least some of the classical theology. My impression is that many panentheists, especially in the science and religion dialogue, they don't actually read much of classical theology, but they tend to criticize it based on based on just general knowledge that they have of the classical tradition. And Gregerson is the one who's actually aware of all that I have mentioned here. He claims that if we think about divine immanence, he says classical theology has a profound notion of divine immanence, but he says there is something that brings a radical division between panentheism and classical theism, and he is right in his assessment, where he says that simply for Aquinas and for classical tradition, all creatures are ordered to God, hence even if the relations but not the other way around. So it's not true that God is ordered towards all things. So, says Gregerson, even if the relation in the heart of the Trinity, the relations in the heart of the Trinity are real, their world's relation to God is real, but their relationship of God towards world is in idea or of reason only, because there is nothing that God can learn in relation to creatures, no challenges to be met, no free act to wait for. So God remains unchanged in relationship to creation. So he then says, and this is important, an important quotation, that what constitutes the common aspiration of the different versions of panentheism, he asks? Well, he suggests that they all share the intuition of a living two-way relation between God and the world within the inclusive reality of God. And according to the classical theism, the nature and activities of the creatures do not have a real feedback on God. And he says this is the primary and stark difference between those two types of understand, or those two models of God-world relationship. Now, speaking from the point of view of the classical tradition, I bring it in my paper, but not in my book. The paper, I wrote it later, and it is my response to one of the interesting challenges that I faced from one of the reviewers. So we should distinguish in our understanding in the classical theology, when we think about relation, we first